purity. Take away the non-essential. Just give us the form, something we can all appreciate. There are a lot of extraneous materials and assemblies in construction, those that keep the waters where it ought to be, those that bridge the differences between the concept and the reality, gutters, grout, felt, and tar, flashing metals and plastic, tortured into coexistence, sand and gravel, and some other material called dense glass. But almost none of it contribute to the vision, to that purity of form that can be found in the eye of the architect. Most of our concepts stop short of the messy stuff.
Gotta accentuate the positive, healing money to negative, and latch on to the affirmative. Don't mess with Mr. In Between. You gotta spread joy up to the maximum, bring gloom down to the minimum, and have faith. Amen. For pandemonium, liable to walk upon the scene. Amen. Don't mess with Mr. In Between. No, don't you mess with Mr. In Between. Got accent.
Wait.
That's it. Positive.
That's enough, right? Okay. So this is a song from the 50s. I think some of you may have heard it. Perry Como sung it. He is the kind of Ocean's 11 cool guy who tells us to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative, which could be an important mantra for those moments when your design becomes captive of some of the code and other obligation. There's a point when the line gets blurry, when the contrast becomes form and function is too fine to lay odds on one or the other. The important thing is to know what is important and what isn't, to relentlessly gauge the impact of the unwanted on the wanted, and not to leave the demanding task of staying true to that vision until it is fully realized. And then if you can get it built that way, that's really kudos to you. Sometimes the God of change throw in an extra icy, something that should have been there all along, that almost gets rid of the non-essential. It takes a kind of sorcery, wizardry, to coax the time and space and weight and materiality of construction into a seamless presence, a je ne sais quoi, something that makes those dreams come true. Mark and his partner Sharon celebrate the sculptural geometry of building spaces that seems to be scrubbed so clean that you look in vain for the beauty spot that might mar its complexion. So immaculate that the axioms of scale and textures are rendered irrelevant. So lucid that our love affair with shade, shadow, and textures has a really icy, a tough rival. That simplicity and purity of form, like a haiku shorn of punctuation, has become the hallmark of our guest. Mark Lee and Sharon Johnston both graduate from Harvard Design School. I think that's where you met. I think that's where you became partner. They've garnered, besides award-winning projects, the prominent and very sought-after commission to design the Menil Drawing Institute in Houston. But they also garnered the most diverse projects in the most exotic locales, from Penco in Chile to Grottaferrata in Italy, earning enough miles to join George Clooney's 10 million frequent flyer smile club. Please welcome Mark Lee and Sharon Johnston.
Thank you, Ming, for the beautiful introduction. I just came back from Europe on economy, so didn't sleep that well, still with a little bit of jet lag. We gave a public lecture here at SCI-Arc exactly 10 years ago. And like tonight, it was also through the invitation of the students. So we thank the students for the interest and the opportunity to be here and share some of our projects. I think speaking here is like speaking to friends and family. Sharon taught here many years ago. We're speaking amongst friends, former students, former friends, former lovers. Oh, sorry. So there's a certain degree of familiarity, I think, speaking here. At the same time, speaking here, there's a certain degree of exoticism too. Why is that? I think SCI-Arc has, for us, has this incredible reputation of being at the forefront of architecture experimentation and a certain devotion to a certain degree of mastery and a virtuosity that really something that we really admire. Before we came here, Andy Zago was showing us the drawings of his students, and we're blown away. There's a certain position that SCI-Arc holds, being the purveyor of the new, that we admire, but at the same time we like to observe from a certain distance. I think for us that the new is something that we hold in high regards. It's not something that's trivial. That in a way we put on the pedestal is that the new is not something that not happens often, but it's really a combination of will, of talent, as well as opportunity. And I always think of one's career as really preparing the moment when, if it happens, or if it happens at all, to step up and create something that is new, not contrived, but really channeling all the forces together to make that happen. I think maybe our position could best be summarized by a quote by Aldo van Eyck, who once said that during a time of change, an architect should not be a slave to history. But more importantly, that the architect should not be a slave at all, and in no time should the architect be a slave to change. And I think this is a mantra that we adopted at the outset. And we see our work as the evolution, as a continuation of a larger lineage and history of architecture. So within that framework, tonight we'd like to show you a cross-section of our projects from the last 10 years. The projects are not just projects of our own work, but it's really the fruits of collaboration with many people, Katrin ter Stegen, Nicholas Hofstedt, Anton Schneider, Andre Lucia, Lindsay Erickson, Rodolfo Diaz, people that we work with closely together. I think one of the shared beliefs that we have in the office is that architecture does boundaries best. I think 10 years ago when we talked, we still were at this moment where we believe, or we look into the breaking of boundaries. But I think the more we indulge ourselves into the discipline, we realize that architecture does limitations, but the best. They do boundaries the best. And as a result, our projects could be seen as a collection of projects that define boundaries, that are composed of a series of objects. Objects not necessarily as a series of aloof objects or closed objects or autonomous objects, but objects that eventually contributes to a city. And in our mind, Los Angeles is very much a city of objects.
So tonight we're going to talk about a collection of work, really as a city of objects, as Mark said. And I think what unifies all of these projects of very diverse scales is a sense that in each one of these buildings, there's always a sense of the multiple or one thing on the verge of becoming something else. So whether it's an interior volume nested within something massive on the exterior, or where one building multiplies to become a double and the space between them is an active space of investigation for us, to the idea of the multiple where self-similar size objects begin to multiply and approximate something altogether different in scale and function. And finally, to some of the larger scale projects we're working on today where almost begin to approximate a kind of urban scale and produce a kind of aura that is both diverse and in that sense urban, but also still maintains a sense of oneness and sense of collective coherence. So tonight the lecture will be organized according to the following categories of singular objects, doubles, multiples, and what we're calling a kind of new singularity, the larger scale, more urban projects.
So we will start off with these singular objects. I think for us, singular objects are objects that stand alone, but they straddle between the line of being complex and being simplistic. I think they straddle the line of being an observer as well as being a participant. The first project that we'd like to show you is a project in the town of Rosario in Argentina, and about 3 hours north of Buenos Aires, and it's situated at the edge of a development. When we designed the project, there's really no buildings around, but we know that in the future, 2 of the 4 sides will be occupied with buildings. So when we planned the building, we preemptively thought about where the future buildings would be and begin to figure out the circulation and the apertures of the building that would look through where the future buildings would be. So the house is organized around a spiral circulation, and every time one turns, one is exposed to a different frame of the landscape. It's the first time we built outside of the US, and so we basically use a very simple geometry, which is a primitive that is a marriage between a rectangle and an ellipse. And then we deploy 4 cuts for the desired to be an object sitting in the corner. 2 of the cuts are straight cuts on singular curved surfaces, and 2 of them are fragments of spheres. Our logic is that if they could build the concrete formwork of a sphere, they could easily build a fragment of a sphere. So these cuts are positioned at opposite edges of the volume, opposite corners of the volume, and they have a contingent relationship with the apertures. So the openings are really always next to one of these cuts. And then there's secondary openings that will bring natural light into the space, such as this is the space right behind the spherical cut. And then one spirals up and exits into a semi-enclosed room before one ascends up into the roof garden. And then all the views that one were experienced fragment in a series of fragments were exposed again, all as a panorama. In contrast to the interior is much more open, with a double height space. As one walks through the house, one always experiences a cut and then adjacent to one of the openings. Someone mentioned that this house, someone we don't know mentioned that this house is a love child between Mario Botta and a septic tank, which we're not sure if that's a good, I think it's a good compliment. I think it's a compliment, yeah. And then at the end of this circle, one exits into this room, a room that is semi-enclosed before one ascends up into the roof garden and then see the panorama of the pampas again. We think of the space, the interior space that's contained by this brutal volume, not necessarily as a resultant, but also as something that is three-dimensional, almost like a bubble that has its form shaped by the container, but at moments, like the corner window, begins to declare its own existence. Another project in South America is in Chile, in the town of Penco. It's a pavilion, and the auspices of this project was 10 architects were invited to design pavilions in commemoration with the second largest earthquake in Chile. And the goal is that the first 5 years of the existence of these pavilions will be used for services to the local town. So if they need a schoolhouse, if they need a meeting room, and then once the reconstruction effort is over, it would be converted into an exhibition space, and exhibitions would travel from one town to another town throughout the Biobío region that has been devastated. And all the architects were given a very small lot, but nevertheless a beautiful lot. And in our case, we are situated on a bluff on top of a cliff overlooking the bay. So it's situated within a pine forest. One walks through the forest, and at the end you see this half-moon bay. Although we are not sure what the use of this pavilion would be in the first 5 years of its life, I think the essence of its becoming has to do with disaster, and that there's a certain degree of memory that plays into it. So we decided that the size of this building needs to be double, virtually double. So we created an open courtyard. That one will always walk into this empty courtyard as a preface before you walk into the space again. So the concept of the building is really two rooms. Two of them are half ellipses, almost exactly the same dimension. So when one walks through the forest, one will walk into a courtyard first before you enter into a space. So this is the model. Without the roof, you can see one major room, and we put all the ancillary programs, the bathrooms and such on the edges. It's really a project that is driven by the plan. Everything is extruded, and it's one story. We really see the courtyard as something that is just defined by the wall. So we don't even the ground is not paved. And but you always see the view of the next room that you're entering into before you see the view. So we also propose to use the trunks of the pine tree as the formwork for the first courtyard. So as you walk through the forest, you have this rhythm of this, or the cadence of the size of these pine trees. So you suddenly walk into this half ellipse shape from the diagonal, and then you almost have this very rough béton brut type of surface. And in contrast, the enclosed room is built out of almost mirrored polished concrete. So the two rooms of the exact size, one being very rough, that is oriented towards the sky, and the other being very smooth and oriented towards the ocean. So in a way, the reflection, our goal is that when you're in the space, when you're captivated by the view itself, one is always conscious that you're in a half-ellipse room. It's almost a theater-like room where the horizon line begins to continue through the space and behind you and around you. This is a house that just finished a few months ago. This is situated in the town of Oxnard. It's between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. And like many beachfront houses, the problem with these lots are they're very narrow and they're very deep. So oftentimes you have to enter quite unceremoniously through the alley into the house. And most of these houses, they plan to have their living rooms here and their master bedroom above, which are great for those two rooms. But the rest of the house is dark and undesirable to be. So at the outset, we wanted to create a large courtyard in the darkest part of the house to bring as much light in as the entry courtyard. So one has some spatial relief before you walk into the house. And then the second thing we wanted to do is to bring as much view and light into the space as possible from the ocean side. So the concept is to give every room a shape, in this case a barrel vault, that faces the ocean. They're stacked together like sardines. They don't overlap, but they're all directed towards the ocean. So in a way, all the rooms have a defined space. But because of the orientation, even when you're 2/3 into the house, you always see the ocean or feel the orientation of the ocean. So if you cut a series of cross-section, there's sometimes a double height space, sometimes a series of smaller spaces. But even when you're deep into the house, when the fragment of the view is very small, you feel this type of shotgun house relationship between one room and another. Because the house is in this tsunami zone, so part of the house have to be elevated in case a tsunami comes. So we take the same vaulting system to lift the part of the house that needs to be vaulted. And then one looks from the beach side, one looks through this double height living space, through the master bedroom above, through the kitchen, dining room, and then into the courtyard and beyond. So, sometimes we have these happy accidents when one vault meets another vault. And then sometimes we have some unhappy ones like this, like some Gothic arches begin to appear. You know, the side facing the street is actually quite anonymous, almost like a Irving Gill or Adolf Loos house that works quite well with the Spanish colonial houses around. We even use the vault, half vault, to carve the edge of the building to create more space, in contrast to the beach side, which is much more porous. So this was, I think, shot right after it was finished. The adjacent lot right in front of the house is a lot it's not built yet, but we anticipate it would be built. So all the openings, all the views are really coming from the beach itself. The windows on the side are mainly for light. We just have a very simple rule. All the windows on the side, they're on the ground floor, are vaults, and all the openings that are clear story windows are upside down. So you don't have this a groin vault as you have in Romanesque basilicas. So one walks to the middle of the house, enter into the courtyard, and then from the courtyard, one enters into the house through the kitchen, through the double height space, and then out into the balcony and the beach. This view, we are almost to the street, almost with our back to one room and then the street. But even here, you can see through the courtyard. We're at the intersection of two vaults, looking into the vault of the courtyard, and then into the master bedroom and through to the main living room. I want to show three projects that we're working on quite quickly. This is a house in Matarrana in Spain, halfway between Valencia and Barcelona. It is a weekend house, 2,500 square feet, large plot of land, but it's situated in a grove of almond trees. And almond trees are very short, 2 meters high, but when it blossoms, all the flowers turn white. So we decided to lift the house. So when it blossoms, you feel like you're surfing on top of a canopy, an ocean of these almond flowers. It's really a house with 4 rooms, but the rooms could be opened up so they all could be connected and have this panoramic view. And then one arises from the main living space to the rooftop with a jacuzzi. And for us, I think that the spatial tension between the house is not only in relationship to this curved window and the profile of the hills, but also with the tension of the curved walls inside. I think this tension we first tried in the winery in Montepulciano in Tuscany, where there are some existing farmhouses, and we have to build a building, and we decide to half bury it so it doesn't interrupt this panoramic view. When it's half buried, and with a subsequent gallery and future additions, we really think of the profile of the building and how the profile works with the profile of the hills in the distant view. Geometrically, it's very simple. The volume is really part of a larger sphere. You know, I think we try to find different diagrams to approach a project. You know, when we first designed the volume, maybe it's closer to Zaha's Cardiff Bay Opera House as a folded bar. But at one point during the design, another diagram, a geometric diagram, begins to take over, and this sphere becomes something that unites both the two main wings as well as the 2 wing walls. And the reason is we didn't want to recreate the view that you have above. You know, so we want to create a space that is open to the distance, but also have this nested quality, like at the Salk Institute. You know, it's a room, but it's a very projected way of expansion. So So we think that the two curved walls that bend outwards, and we use the recycled water from the wine production as a reflecting pool coming all together at one point. So when one is above, you see this open landscape, and once when you walk down, you see this type of nested room with the reflection of the sky. And then the exterior is cladded with antiquarian brick. It was part of the code of the building in Tuscany. I think this tension between larger moves or larger curvatures and smaller curvatures, we also tested in a house that just completed up in Brentwood, that is situated at the edge, right below this little Charles Gwathmey house, on the edge of this valley that's slightly curved. So we took the curvature as the geometry of the house, and then begin to create a series of nesting rooms that are within the space. So one enters in a perpendicular way to the house, and one finds itself in the center, like Frank Lloyd Wright, and then one turns, and then one sees the view again. So the very slight curvature of the house is in contrast to the flat glass that is right behind. So when the glass is all open, there's a lining of this wall that creates a more intermediate space. And sometimes this lining continues and become apertures for skylights. Sometimes the skylight cuts open in stairs. Sometimes the skylight filters through and becomes a clear story window. And then one finds the curvature again in the rooms above, in the mezzanine.
So this is the category of the double, and the doubling has been present in our work since the really earliest projects. It often comes about because of an existing circumstance, in this case, or because of a condition of the site, an extreme section. And I think it has been a tool for us to sort of absorb difference, but still find coherence in the overall figure of the building. So this first project is our contribution to the Ortos 100 project. There might be other people in the audience that were subjects like us to this social experiment on the part of Weiwei and Herzog and Demeron. But Mark got to skip the whole trip, but I had to go to the desert in Western China a couple times. And this was
I had to go to Monte Pachano.
This is the result. It's maybe an architect's wonderland or an orgy gone bad, depending on your point of view. But in any case, this was our contribution, the red model. And in a way, we approached this project more as a kind of urban proposition than a single-family suburban project. And in that way, tried to think about the most primitive idea of a house, and then imagine what it would mean to multiply that form in a way to begin to engage an urban condition. And so in addition to that, we rotate the building on the site so that it somehow is approximating and grabbing a much larger scale of space through the corridors of view and the way that it's viewed always on the oblique. And so this doubleness, the project is called House. What was important for us was that it always had this sense of doubleness in every view from every angle, but no two views were the same, so that you were always moving around it and perceiving it differently. It's a relatively large building by Chinese standards, 1,000 square meters, and the only parameter given by Weiwei and the client was that it would be in cast-in-place concrete and clad in brick. And so part of this, our strategy of doubling was also thinking about structure and aperture. So oftentimes we look at ways to mitigate the mass of the building through the placement of the apertures, playing with flatness and depth, so the building feels both massive and sometimes quite flat and planar. The catalog of windows works towards that, the kind of diversity of program elements and the way that the structure works, so that it is, again, has both a sense of flatness and depth, massiveness and planar flatness. And in this aerial view, captures the roof as a kind of fifth facade, where this light core, which is also sort of a solar chimney, reveals the hollow nature of the building, really, despite its size. And then on the interior, the rooms are planned from very kind of large double-height spaces in the public areas, and up to the top of the building, the master living areas that have a very tight fit with the envelope of the house. This project is just recently completed last October. It was our contribution to the Shanghai, the West Bund Architecture Biennale. So it's, this is our site, this little triangular site, which is just south, along the Bund, south of the center of Shanghai. And it's part of, in a way, not dissimilar to some of the efforts for the Chile project, where there's a government plan to redevelop this whole area for housing, and the first elements of that redevelopment are a number of cultural buildings. So we were one of the few people that was built our pavilion in phase one. Bow Wow from Japan is developing. Young Ho Chan is building a pavilion. And then, for example, here, this will be a new museum by David Chipperfield. And so it's sort of a no man's land. And in that way, the building needs to accommodate many programs over a long period of time. So our approach was to make a pairing of two different kinds of volumes, smaller volumes. It's called the Pavilion with Six Views. So 3 of them are oriented outwards, and then the other 3 oriented inwards towards a central open air courtyard. So from the exterior, it has a sort of loose fit, kind of slightly ambling quality as a mass. And then kind of zooming out, it also acknowledges the scale, the sort of erasing scale of the industrial past of this landscape, and some of the kind of smaller scale pavilions that serve as kind of construction buildings and such at this point. So this pairing of inward and outward volumes, first this is the exterior view of one of those rooms that has a very immediate connection to the street and the plaza, in contrast to this kind of pinch where you enter. And then the interior, these rooms always have this kind of panoramic view coupled with a skylight at the other end. So this play of light and shadow is quite dynamic, despite the kind of self-similarity of all the rooms. They're always changing in atmosphere. In contrast to the inwardly facing rooms, which are oriented towards this atrium courtyard and have a kind of slight sense of, near sense of continuity, just pinched by these moments where they intersect the outwardly oriented volumes. So in plan, it can feel both a series of discrete objects, but also there's a sense of continuity between the continuous path of space between the 3 interior volumes. So in the end, the exterior of the building has at one moment a sort of small footprint, and also at other moments feels as if it's sort of opening up and really engaging the life of the plaza. So this project was part of a competition. I think one of the offspring of all of our friends we made in China. So there was some upside to that whole experience. And this was a competition that was, one of the finalists was Chris Gantenbein, a Basel-based firm, and they decided that instead of doing all this work as one project in their office in the final phase of the competition, they would invite some of their friends from around the world. So this is our contribution, Office from Belgium, Lakatan Basal from Paris, Bow Wow from Japan, Sturgis and Bates from London, lots of friends and family. And so our site is exactly in the middle of this parcel. Lake Geneva is just here. And it was the master plan was designed together with the Swiss landscape architect Günter Vogt. So what was unique about it is that there's no cars at grade. It's all a sort of meadow of wildflowers, and all the parking is below. And so our site was not only in the middle, but also was one of the key connections from below grade. And in addition, it was right in the middle of the site of a steep sectional change. And so the idea for the project was to maximize the perimeter, make the biggest building we could, of course, and then begin to carve out the network of paths for public circulation. And the goal was to maintain as much of the perimeter as we could so that we could maximize that view and then create this kind of networked series of courtyards. So in a way, it's a kind of inside-out house where the perimeter is quite continuous, and then the views within and out of the block of the building are quite discrete. The logic of the kind of linking of the courtyards was really to minimize these points of connection so that these became kind of discrete and autonomous spaces, maintaining a kind of, in a way, a definition as a space, and that the public nature of moving through them had a kind of procession that was, in a way, quite urban. And then in the same way, the way they met the edge maintained that sort of minimal interruption. We minimize the apertures in these courtyards simply for access into the buildings, and in moments where there was continuity of public program in the unit from that perimeter into the inner block. So that this diagonal view always sort of drew you through the building and had that almost, you began to perceive the inner block of the building as a series of pieces and not one singular block. So on the perimeter, that kind of continuity of the facade is maintained despite the sectional change. And so the next category is the multiples. And I think what's been interesting for us is the scale of some of our projects has started to grow a little bit, is how can we use this sort of repetition of self-similar objects to begin to approximate something oftentimes much larger or maybe very different in function. And what results is, for us, quite interesting inventions of structure, kinds of hybrid types of spaces. And then when we began to think about larger scale buildings, how we can take this sort of bottom-up approach of aggregation to describe a much bigger building through a set of discrete and more local circumstances. So this is the project we've been working on for quite a long time, the same client that we're doing the winery for. It's in Grottaferrata. It's a suburb of Rome, and it's a kind of historic town. This is the main Corso del Popolo. This is an important abbey, where the paper restoration abbey where the Da Vinci Codex was restored. And so that proximity is, of course, important, and this kind of strange no man's land of property that has sort of been in arrested development for quite a long time. So there's a diverse group of buildings, historic buildings, a 19th century villa, and these sort of strange half-abandoned hotels and office buildings, housing that was sort of left to decay, and then this park. And this will be deeded back to the city as a public arts park. And so given that diversity of buildings and vintages and programs, the project will be a kind of mixed-use arts campus. So there'll be galleries, spaces for artists to work, creative office building, retail, and then some housing. Our approach to the project was to look for a kind of uniform set of building blocks that we could, in a way, very elemental pieces we could aggregate in different ways to respond to these different conditions and programs. So as a simple diagram, this is the museum, gallery, housing, sort of flexible exhibition space, creative office building, and then sort of art exhibition spaces in the park. This is just a quick study of the museum building. It's immediately adjacent to these medieval carriage houses, which form a really interesting scale, almost like a medieval street next to the villa. And so our approach here was to really continue that scale of the street and form a plaza courtyard through the aggregation of these 5 volumes, and then find a way that the program was that it could be 5 different spaces or one continuous exhibition space. So the strategy then to unify the 5 volumes was through this continuous cut of the roof, so that it has a kind of clarity in roof that allows for the diversity of function and division of space beneath. This is the creative office building, now a very different kind of site circumstance, surrounded by 3 large blocks. So it's really a building in the round. And our approach was to then aggregate, almost create a kind of ring structure, and then stack the volumes and rotate them, so that there's no real front to this building, but it somehow engages all of the surrounding circumstances in quite a steep sectional change through this very simple logic of aggregating around a central void. And then finally, the housing. This is a portion of the project we collaborated with the Swiss architects HHF, and in this case, we had a really tight footprint to get a lot of housing units on. And so we proposed to stack the units like little mini towers, and then the plan is to use the rooftops as the entry, so we displace the private garden, which is sort of typical in this region, to the roof, affording great views back to Rome, and then you descend into the unit to the more private spaces below. So we maintain the autonomy of the ground as a public space. This is a single-family house in Kauai, and it's on the north shore of Kauai. It's really one of the wettest places in the world. And so our client really wanted to, her program for us was simply, I want 4 I want 4 different living spaces, 4 houses under one roof. So it's really a kind of 50-50 planning where 50%, the gray stuff is unconditioned and the white volumes are the conditioned space. And then they're all unified under one roof. And really the only restriction in this region of Kauai is you're given a very sketchy black and white Xerox of what's called a Hawaiian style roof. And that's somehow you have to engage that as the kind of zoning parameter. So of course what we did is made it 3 times bigger than what would be typical, got rid of all the extraneous details, and then cut a big hole in the middle. So this is basically a 6,000, about 6,500 square foot footprint with a courtyard. And then these apertures, within that courtyard are skylights that bring light into the deepest portions of the house. And in the way that the cut is oblique to the perimeter of the house, the roof dips and swells according to the needs of light and program. And then even almost in certain views, it almost feels like it's splitting into 2, but it's unified by this lanai space which wraps the entire building. And at other views, it feels quite precariously placed upon that base. In contrast to the interior of the house, which is quite volumetric and really fills the entire kind of 20-foot high interior ceiling height with light, and then the courtyard is quite a compressed space that opens to the sky.
Well, I think this is a good segue into something that we have been preoccupied for a long time, which is the Hawaiian-style roof. No, it's just the roof. I think at one point when a building approaches a certain scale, strategies of doubling, strategies of aggregation is not sufficient to form a larger whole. And we are very aware of this, I don't know what, for lack of a better word, a Mario Bota problem, that certain types and certain forms work for a certain scale, doesn't work for a medium scale, and then when it becomes a teapot, it works again. And so this intermediary scale, I mean, the roof becomes something for us to unify more disparate aggregations. And it happened in a series of earlier competitions to house renovations. I mean, the whole idea of roof as a primitive hut or a roof as something that unifies. But in the early project, I think there's a certain detachment of the roof, maybe closer to Yona Friedman or Constant, almost that the ground is allergic. We're allergic to the ground. I think in the last 2 projects we like to show, we begin to look at the roof again, look at the ceiling as a way of organizing space underneath again, but with more engagement with what's happening below.
So this is a project that's in the early stages we're working on for the UCLA Graduate Art Studios building. It's in the Hayden Track in Culver City. So it's on a corner, and it's kind of a messy parcel with one really nice old 20s wallpaper factory building and this sort of aggregation of appendages over time. So our approach was really direct. We eliminated all of this extra stuff. We extend a continuous ground at the level of 3 feet above grade, the existing condition of the warehouse. We extend claim the entire block with a new facade, and then extend the logic of the historic bow truss roof as a roof plane that frames the entire site. So we create this kind of pure envelope of space. So as a diagram, this is the historic bow truss building that we extend and then develop a kind of logic of interior and exterior spaces underneath, and then that's wrapped by a kind of solar umbrella-like roof that creates an unconditioned but covered space surrounding the edge, the kind of street edge of the building. So I think as Mark said, if early on in our career the roof became a sort of hovering abstract mediator of atmosphere and light, here we're beginning to look in these last 2 projects at ways to really engage the logic and the kind of tectonics of the roof and part of the space and more direct engagement with the architecture. So this is the entry to the building from the spur. It's one of the sort of leftover circulation spaces in the planning of that area. And so in terms of planning, the idea here is that there's a number of artist studios, of course, for the students, and then the addition of labs, classrooms, galleries that are more kind of collective spaces. So the result is that on the south and west facades, the building is much more porous and open to the street, in contrast to the other elevations, which are more connected to, immediately adjacent to other buildings. And the building kind of engages this vernacular, kind of industrial, very generic building logic, but begins to look at the assembly of the roof and the way that the space of the roof structure can begin to define a program space in the building. So as conceiving of the entire building precinct as a kind of mini city, it's anchored by a number of kind of key infrastructure elements. The street arcade, which connects the street to the student parking, what's called Center Bay. So this is the existing warehouse, and it's reconfigured as a kind of village of studios where the primary studios are. And then a series of workshop buildings so that the yards become another one of those places, kind of collective spaces between the kind of city outside and the inner life. And then a garden, which is a kind of active place for the students to produce work, talk about work, as a kind of flexible space. And we've always been fascinated by this sort of this logic of the warehouse, the big hall, and of course this image of Mies is been dear to us for a long time, but we got kind of fascinated when we were beginning to think about this kind of infrastructure and the kind of space planning, and wanted to look actually at what was behind what was masked out in the case of Mies, and began to think not so much about framing a space by inserting planes, but actually creating apertures into this kind of extended landscape and how we can engage that in a way through the making of rooms and openings to the larger scale envelope of the roof plane. So just a few images to walk you through the building. This is the entry into the kind of covered but unconditioned arcade. The garden, this kind of flexible space where the roof the stair is hung from the truss, and so this whole upper open mezzanine level is really threads through the reconfiguration of the truss as a kind of barrel vault in the areas where you circulate. This is the Center Bay, the space in the historic building where this sort of village-like arrangement of the studios gives this sort of near definition of a plaza, but it really celebrates the reconditioned existing truss. This is the workshop next to the metal lab, where once again the kind of conditioned or unconditioned but covered space creates a interesting atmospheric zone between the interior space of the studios and the street. So we're hoping that in the end this building will be generic but cool enough that Ed Ruscha might think of it as a new icon in LA. So this is the last project. This is a project that's pretty active in our office right now. It's a competition we won about a year and a half ago for what's called the Menil Drawing Institute. So it's on the campus in Houston, and just a little bit of orientation. This is the Menil Collection building. So this is the Renzo Piano building that was completed about 25 years ago. This is the Rothko Chapel, Philip Johnson, the Byzantine Chapel, Francois de Menil. This is the Twombly Gallery, also by Renzo, and then this is called Richmond Hall, which is kind of a generic building that was reconfigured by Dan Flavin. So those are the primary art buildings on the campus, and for those of you that haven't been there, it's really a building or a campus. It's a residential campus defined by this kind of great mothership, the Menil building, and then these pavilions, which are distributed throughout the campus. And I think what defines this collection of museum spaces is really the use of natural light, and more specifically the way that light comes in from above. So from the invention of Renzo, the ferro-cement concrete leaves, to this is Richmond Hall, all of these buildings modulate light in different ways, but light from above is really what defines the experience of art at the Menil. Making up the fabric of the campus, and really what makes it special and kind of completely unpretentious and almost really magical, is this landscape of bungalows that Dominique and John, when they were developing the campus, really wanted to celebrate and maintain. So they're all painted a uniform coat of gray, and in addition to these buildings is a great fabric of existing primarily oak trees that are not only beautiful but provide really important shade and kind of atmosphere throughout the campus. So this is the existing condition. Our new building is essentially right here, which is about the geographic center of the campus. So there's a master plan that was completed by David Chipperfield a couple of years ago, which plans the entire redevelopment of the campus, and the Drawing Institute is the first building in that redevelopment plan.
So I think the first thing that we needed to do is to tear down part of the housing continue the street, a network of pedestrian paths, and a new landscape designed by Michael van Valkenburg. And then the new Drawing Institute, and then also a new energy house with the demolition of the rest of the building. Right now, all the main entry is from the north, from the parking lot, but Richmond Avenue is being redeveloped, and we foresee that there are a lot more people coming in from the south, past Dan Flavin, and this would be a new entry to the Menil campus. When Dominique de Menil commissioned Piano, she asked for a building that looks small on the outside but big on the inside. I think, on the contrary, our Drawing Institute, when we did the competition, we stretched beyond the given parameters. We really think this building needs to be big on the outside and small on the inside. For reasons of scale, for reasons of how the building faces a larger park, how it works together with the energy house that we're designing in concert with Twombly to form a new intermediary scale space. Furthermore, the works on paper are sensitive to light, but they're also small in scale. There's a certain degree of immediacy to the work. I don't know if anyone has seen the Paul Klee Centrum in Bern. Very small scale drawings that are better in domestic sized galleries, but put in a huge warehouse. And sometimes we think the contrast works, but sometimes not. So with the collection full of surrealist drawings, with post-war American paintings, drawings, we really designed a space that really fits a really specific collection with space to grow. And the concept really is to create a very thin sheet of paper that stretches beyond the site and embraces the existing trees and meanders around the trees. And then underneath this thin sheet, a steel roof, are 3 volumes, exhibition, administration, and study. And then unified by a roof, and then with 3 courtyards. The 2 courtyards, the east and west courtyards, are entry courtyards. So one always enters into these courtyards before entering into the building. And we see these courtyards as both belonging to the park as well as the museum. So for us, it's an in-between space. But it becomes a space that is shaded by the trees, the canopy of the trees, and partially defined by the porch of this courtyard. So in a way, that one is adjusted to the light level from the harsh sun of the exterior to the courtyard before entering into the building. So in a way, it becomes a crossing points of many different pathways, whether one is entering from the Byzantine to your right, or coming from the south, or coming from the north above. Mm-hmm.
So, as Mark mentioned, the issue of light is really critical. If you, just as a kind of metric, you start, the typical Texas sun is, I think, 10,000 foot candles, and the ideal environment to view drawings is 5. And so how do we get through that gradient and within the footprint of a really small building? So these are some of the early studies that obviously red is hot and a lot of sun, and gray is less sun. And so both the trees, the way the trees work, the way the courtyards, roof canopies work, all sort of start that step down before you get into the gallery. The kind of typical situation is a sort of matinee effect where you get into a drawing gallery and you feel disoriented and you can't see because it feels really dark, when actually it's quite a generous lighting condition. So we've been developing this roof structure together with Guy Nortenson, who I believe was here last year, and really, if all the kind of precedent buildings at the Menil campus are about light and light from above, in our case, light from above is essentially not an option. And so how this idea of drawing over the roof over the landscape became a challenge of how could we create this extended roof plane that was as thin as possible. So this is a view of the Drawing Institute from the south that shows this sort of attenuated roof, which is 8 inches thick, and it has sort of cantilevers sometimes of 60 feet. So it's from the south, the building feels quite mute and quiet and really forms just a porch to the garden to the south. Alternatively, coming from the north, so Twombly would be essentially right here to your right. The courtyard really, almost like a catcher's mitt, really grabs you visually and forms an entry as a garden room before moving into the interior of the building.
So this is a view approaching from the south corner. So one finds itself in this diagonal view in relationship to the entry of the space. So you see this cantilevered roof, that porch that cantilevers downwards.
I mean, I think the issue with the roofs is that they work in conjunction with the tree canopies, so that qualities of light and kind of projected shadow are a critical part of that kind of atmosphere that is a prelude to getting into the building.
And exactly the same as on the eastern courtyard, albeit with a very different landscape that is much closer to the landscape of the domestic areas to the east. And then from the east and the north, one enters into this living room, which was not called for in the original program, but we grouped all the circulation area into a non-functioning space. We see this more than a foyer, but really like a multi-purpose room like in the Shaker houses, where they could have large meetings, they could have events that, politically activist events that Menil has been famous for in its history, or possibility for curation or co-curation for curators to use for spaces next to the gallery that could accommodate pieces that are less light sensitive. But in this living room, which is the heart of the building, one is always visually connected to the courtyard. So in a way, we follow the lineage of the Philip Johnson's first house for the de Menils. They eventually became the DNA for Piano's building. And then from there, parallel to that is the gallery space, which is one large span, but could be subdivided into smaller rooms. And then adjacent to the living room on the other side is a scholar courtyard that's only accessible by, for the scholars and curators.
I think this space, like some of the living room and other spaces in the building, it's always kind of about buffers. This is a space, an important space between the public life of the administrative part of the building and the study room, which is really the inner sanctum of the building. And so light and landscape work together to create that more intimate scale as a transition between the inner life of the building and the drawing room.
And then in contrast to a larger, more confident facade facing the south, on the western side is really broken down into smaller volumes and smaller pavilions. The height of the building, the top of this steel roof is 16 feet, which is lower than the Twombly Pavilion, but slightly higher than the pre-war houses that surround. So in a way, the section of the building is reminiscent of the scale of the houses, in a way that the living room space, this gable that results from the two cantilevers, also recall the spaces and the dimensions of the house around.
I think in many ways this building is, it's a building between an institutional scale, the scale of the museum, and the scale of a house. And this idea of a kind of in-between condition is something that's fascinated us in this project and really in a lot of our work, where it's somewhere between building and landscape, between interior and exterior. And I think this kind of twilight condition captures that sort of suspended state that we feel is sort of provides no barrier, but is at the same time very intimate and immediate as a kind of suitable atmosphere for viewing drawings in this historic campus of the Menil.
And I think this whole notion of being in the middle has been something that we have embraced throughout our whole practice. And for us, I think being in the middle is not a static being, is not a common denominator on average between differences, but it's really something that is a dynamic state of oscillation between extremes. We find being in the middle is something that is constantly oscillating, and I think this is a state that we try to find in our work, and this is a state that we try to maintain in our design. So that's the end of our talk. Thank you very much.